His third album was called The Sergeant Pepper of Folk. It's an American singer-songwriter who kind of got lost. There's a brand new book about him. We're talking to the author on Rock History Music. Mark Brend has a brand new book called Downriver on singer-songwriter and former child actor David Ackles. In '72, he released his third album, American Gothic, which was produced by Elton John's songwriting partner, Bernie Taupin. Melody Maker called it a classic. The Sunday Times called it the Sergeant Pepper of folk, but it did not become a hit. He had a lot of famous fans, including Elton John, who he opened for with that famous Troubadour show, which was Elton John's North American concert debut. And he had fans like Phil Collins, Elvis Costello. It's an interesting story with a gentleman who had a voice and a beautiful timbre that was hard to forget. After this interview, I hope you look him up if you're not familiar with David Ackles. We talked to the author of a brand new book, Downriver, Mark Brend, on Rock History Music. The weird thing about artists like David, I'd listen to American Gothic and I'd listen going, this is like Harry Chapin meets Billy Joel, because I got it late. Because I didn't get it when it was released, and again, what's the running theme here is, wow, where do you put this guy? Where did it start for you? And how old were you year wise? When did you first discover him?
Well, I discovered him in 1985. So I was let me see, I was 23 then. I'm 63 now, and I came across his first album in the shop, a second-hand copy, and I liked the look of the sleeve, and it was on Elektra, and it was 1968, and I was quite interested in other Elektra singer-songwriters like Tom Rush and Tim Buckley.
They had quite
And
a repertoire back then, yeah.
they did. They had a really good stable of singer-songwriters, and I thought, well, I'll give it a go. But I'd never heard of him before. His name meant nothing to me, so I bought the record on spec, and I absolutely loved it. And then quickly, well, not that quickly, but I gradually acquired the other albums, and my enthusiasm has remained with me ever since.
Even though I like the Chapins and the more ethereal Billy Joel stuff, and Tom Waits even. I don't know where I would put this David Ackles. I don't know where I would put him.
I I think that's true, and I think that was true then. That was true when he was recording, and it's true now. And I think that probably contributed to his inability to make a big commercial success of his recording career. He is very hard to categorize. It's interesting that you mentioned Harry Chapin, because he signed to Elektra toward the end of David Ackles' time there, and they were good friends, in fact. But Harry Chapin found a way of perhaps taking some similar influences, but making some more recognizably pop songs out of it, I think. Whereas David Ackles, he had lots of influences, but he had this big musical theatre thing, and that I think that isn't readily understood for a rock audience. It wasn't then, and it isn't now. And I think that always set him apart, and that's remained a kind of thing that people find hard to get what's going on, really.
American Gothic, for instance, the Bernie Taupin album produced, and that album really is brilliant, though. If you started listen to it from start to finish, there are the pretty songs still, like you heard on his first two albums. Uh, it has all those moments. So, what's your takeaway from that particular record? Because I mean, they compared it to Sergeant Pepper's.
Yeah, I mean, it got an extraordinary response in the press, in the American press and the British press at the time. People calling it the Sergeant Pepper of folk and one of the greatest albums ever made and everything. And it was his, I think it was his big statement. He was in control. He wrote all the songs, obviously, and sang them. But he also arranged the album. And so it was probably the first time out of his four albums where he really got exactly what he wanted. He worked very hard on it, and it's an extraordinary record. I think it's one of those things where you have to sit down and listen to the whole thing and concentrate quite hard. It's not something you have on in the background and you dip in and out of. It requires attention, but it rewards attention if you give it, I think.
There was something about American Gothic where I kind of go, Does that break a man putting that much into it? It's such a monumental piece, the whole album as it is. How do you think it affected him um, after it was finished? I mean, the reviews were great, but
Yeah, there was a funny thing with the reviews. If you line them all up, you see a slight change in the weather after a while because initially the reviews were fantastic and there were an awful lot of them, but then a little bit later on, you kind of you get a few reviews saying, "Well, yeah, this is quite good, but I'm not quite sure what's going on here,
as
and
you
is it?"
said, reviews of the reviews.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that became a problem for David Ackles because people were responding to the reputation of the record rather than the music. And in a way, I think that marked the beginning of the end of his recording career because he felt he'd made such a big statement and it had been overly enthusiastically received in his view. And where else do you go after that? It's quite hard. So what he actually did was made a much more modest, intimate record, which is very good. His last album, but I think it posed the response to the record posed problems for him. I think.
His parents, like, was it his mother or father came from more or less a theatrical background?
It was his mother. His mother was English and but emigrated to America when she was a girl. But her mother, Sir David's grandmother, was a music hall performer, and her parents, Sir David's great grandparents, were also music hall performers. So music hall being, I suppose, like variety, they were light entertainers of their time, doing song and dance routines, comedy sketches, and that type of thing. And that was a very big part of David's life, and his mum, I think, encouraged him with that. He and his sister were doing a song and dance routine, performing on stage from when David was about 4, and up until his teenage years, and he was a child actor in some Hollywood B movies. So he definitely had this theatrical showbiz drive in his family, which came from his mother. I think it was a big statement, and I think it was something where you see hints of it in the albums that run up to that.
Yeah.
Influences coming from different areas. So you've got sort of folk and country and soul influences and gospel and what have you. There's sort of hymn singing influences as well. But then the musical theatre thing becomes fully integrated in American Gothic. But I do see you've referred to it as a whole piece of work, and I think that's exactly what it is. It's almost like I wouldn't call it. It's not a concept album, but it's a unified work. It has a consistent sound throughout the album, and it's not the sort of thing that you dip in and out of, and which is of course difficult commercially because there probably aren't obvious singles that the record company could take from it. And but yeah, I think of it as like a collection of short stories, really, a volume of short stories.
He did open for Elton for his debut.
Okay, so that was August 1970, and Elton John was flown over to play his debut, the US debut at the Troubadour in Los Angeles. And there are slightly different reports. Some people say that David Ackles was initially the headliner and the bill was swapped. But actually, if you really dig deep, most people I spoke to said that wasn't the case. That Elton was brought over as the headliner and David was the support. And but the thing that was interesting, because Elton John and Bernie Taupin by then were huge fans of David Ackles. They loved the first two albums, and they have said, they're on record saying many times that they were kind of quite embarrassed and overwhelmed by the fact that one of their heroes was actually the support act.
Yeah.
But apparently they all got on very well and they became friends, and David and Bernie in particular became good friends after that. And of course, Elton, those concerts were very ecstatically reviewed, particularly in the Los Angeles Times, and that was the beginning of Elton John breaking in America. Uh, it wasn't one gig; it was a residency, 6 nights, I think, and the accounts of people who were there say that David Ackles played very well and was well received. So it wasn't like he was ignored or anything like that. But he was obviously overshadowed in a performance sense by the theatricality of Elton John's performance.
There's a quote from Bruce Botnick who basically said that he came up to him, that he was actually, his music was intense, but he was actually, just as a personality, quite quite laid back, right?
Well, it's interesting because he was clearly he's a highly intelligent man, and he was somebody who thought about things deeply and had uh, strongly felt opinions about things. But everyone I spoke to would say that he was good-humored, good company, and not perhaps the gloomy, intense figure you might expect him to be f from some of the songs. That's not to say that he didn't have deeply felt opinions, but he wasn't. He was cheerful and optimistic by all accounts.
After the fourth album, what did he do?
He did lots of things. He turned his hand for a little bit at script writing. He and a guy called Douglas Graham, who co-produced the fourth album, they worked as a script writing partnership, and their biggest thing was a TV movie uh, called Word of Honor, which came out in the early 80s. And was a reasonably accomplished TV movie of that era. He taught as well, and he worked, I think, in charity fundraising, I believe. But it was mainly he was doing teaching back at University of Southern California, where he was a student himself in the 50s and 60s.
What did he pass away of?
He lung cancer. He
Oh,
had cancer in the early 90s and was treated and went into remission for about 5 years, and but then it came back in 98, I think, and he died in 99.
another quote on the second album, Craig Woodson, he says David came over to me and says, "So play something mysterious on drums." I've never heard someone come up to a drummer and say, "Play something mysterious."
No, well, yeah, that was interesting that Craig remembered that. That was quite vivid in his mind because he just did the one session on that album, and that instruction remained has remained in his mind for 50 years since. And he played a part with mallets, I think, to give a kind of muted sound on the tom-toms.
He had the Wrecking Crew, like Jim Gordon was on there on one album. He had like quite a lineup. That's not a cheap album to make. Was that the
No,
second one? Was that the second one? I think.
the second one, Subway to the Country, had I think 22 musicians on it and some really high profile names. And but on the first album, he had a whole attempt at it that was abandoned that was with the Wrecking Crew, really, with about half a dozen members of the Wrecking Crew. And then there were a couple of songs for the second album that started off with Al Cooper, and they were abandoned. So he worked with some pretty big names, but it's an interesting thing because it shows a kind of singularity of purpose because he was working with these great musicians and he was very inexperienced in the studio himself. But he said, "No, this isn't working. I want to do something else." And that shows a strength of purpose, I think, even right at the beginning of his career.
I know that Judy still comes up a lot. Listen to a few podcasts with you, and it begs the question. That'd be a great next book.
Somebody should write a book about Judy Sill. Yeah, definitely.
I'd heard you talk to someone. It was not like the Nick Drake thing, where suicide, and even Judy still, people still argue whether she really
Yeah.
killed herself or not. But then you look at Tommy, you look at the guys in Badfinger, like Pete Ham. My God! But you had said in an interview there wasn't that hook with David Ackles where there was this ultimately big tragedy over the top that makes the headline, you know?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I started to wonder what why it was that there's such a gap between David Ackles' obvious talent and his commercial standing, and not only his commercial standing when he was active, but later and after he died. Because obvious, as we know, some people long after they've died are rediscovered and their music is venerated and their profile uh, raises considerably. That hasn't really happened with David Ackles, and I think it's because his life story doesn't conform to the rock myth trajectory at all. And he, although of course it's sad that he died relatively young of cancer and everything like that, he didn't have this burning out rock and roll lifestyle in any sense. And so what he did was when his recording career finished, he was disappointed. He shrugged his shoulders. He got on with life and had a good life after that. And that we seem to want often a more dramatic story. And I feel that what we have with David Ackles is just the extraordinary music, really. And I, whether that will be enough to win him a wider audience in the end, I don't know.
American Gothic come out in 72.
Yeah.
See, by the time that happened, Elton John was already making the switch because Honky Chateau was released in 72. And there's a big difference between Madman, which is my favorite album of all time. It's the first album I ever bought. And I've talked to Caleb quite a bit about it and Davey. But the difference between Madman Across the Water going into Honky Chateau showed, and that's around the time where Bernie was working with David, because Elton started getting like bombastic by that time. He wasn't the singer-songwriters thing. What have you taken from Bernie's involvement in that album?
Well, I spoke to Bernie for the book, and
Yeah.
he and David had become good friends after the Troubadour gigs, 1970. And David moved to England to make American Gothic. So he lived in England for about 10 months. And Bernie was in England quite a lot then, and they saw a lot of each other. I think Bernie's role, from what I understand, was much more about sort of being supportive and using his weight in the industry, because by then, of course, he was a million selling songwriter, so he had some he had some influence. It was about using his influence to support David, but it wasn't so much a technical role, the technical producer's role. But there was an excellent engineer called Damon Lyon Shaw who engineered the record, who'd engineered Tommy by The Who. And so my understanding is that in the studio, Damon was the technical lead, Bernie was the support and helping David to engage with the business aspect of getting the together. But they both say that David himself was completely in control of the sessions, knew exactly what he wanted, had arranged all of the orchestrations, and they were so well prepared that the record was recorded very quickly. And it's a very complex piece of work, but it was recorded in a week and mixed in a week. That was it. And no drama, very easygoing session. People worked hard, but it's very good humored, and no difficulties at all because David was so well prepared.
Someone asked me before I talked to you, said, well, why wouldn't it have been great if Gus Dudgeon would have recorded? But Gus was one of those. I remember talking to David Henschel about him, and he said Gus didn't land on his feet on everything, even though he produced almost all the big Elton John albums, with the exception of the Disco Victim of Love and I think A Single Man in the 70s. And the first album he didn't produce. But there, I don't see anything. It's not one of those, oh, wouldn't have been great stories when it comes to David Ackles. I'm going, no, those were great. I wouldn't have changed anything. Would you have, looking back, would you think there was a misstep in those four albums? I know that he switched. He went to CBS Columbia on the last one,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I mean, having been in the privileged position of hearing outtakes from all of the albums, like abandoned sessions, certainly what he ended up with, I think, is works much better than the initial tries. So the first album with the where he did tried with the Wrecking Crew with about 8 or 9 members of the Wrecking Crew. Uh, it wasn't quite working. It was interesting, but you could see it wasn't quite working. And compared to the finished album, there's a big gap. So I don't feel that any of the albums lack anything. I think it's a very complete body of work, and it's not as if, oh, if only he'd been with that arranger or that producer, everything would have been different. I don't think that's the case at all. I think I think it's the singularity of his music that but makes him so interesting, but also probably worked against him in terms of commercial success.
I wonder where he would have headed if he after the fourth album. What could have happened? Was is there any lost tapes or anything out there?
There's a lot of stuff. I mean, you see, what he really wanted to do, because it is to write musical theatre. That was his big passion,
Yeah.
and he came into the recording business almost by accident because he ran into David Anderley, who was then just started at Elektra in A&R, and David Anderley and David Ackles had been friends at university together, and they hadn't seen each other for a few years. They ran into each other, and David Ackles said, "Oh, I've got a few songs. What do you think?" And that it was just that got him signed to Elektra. He hadn't made a demo or anything like that. He hadn't been out on touring, playing gigs and trying to attract attention. I think if he continued, what he would have, well, and this is what he tried to do, in fact, was to write musical theatre and would have wanted to get a musical theatre production underway. And he wrote at least two complete musical theatre shows with 20, 30 songs each and whole script and everything like that. And one of them, his last work, which was called Sister Amy, there were several workshop productions of it, but he didn't quite get it into full production. But I think look, imagining an alternative universe, what would have happened is that those theatre productions would have happened and there would have been albums associated with them.
He had that quality of being a great storyteller and sounding like he had been there, or there was just something about him, whether you could put words on it or not.
Mm. Yeah, I think so. I mean, unlike a lot of singer-songwriters, a lot of his songs weren't confessional, and
Yes.
so like a lot of people say somebody like James Taylor or something. He is you get the very strong impression he's telling stories about himself. David Ackles, occasionally there are autobiographical songs, but a lot of the songs are character driven, and the characters, even if he's singing in the first person, aren't David Ackles. He's writing about other people, and it's his way of like he addresses quite difficult subjects like marriage breakdown or the damage that war uh, wreaks on people or racism or something like that. He addresses these subjects through characters. And so he creating miniature dramas, and I think that there's a real skill in that, uh, and a maturity. We shouldn't forget that in rock terms, for those years, he actually was quite old because he was 31 when he made his first record, which was in 1968, was very old to make your debut album.
I can't help but think that if Clive Davis wouldn't have been fired, things could have easily turned out differently because he was a fan.
Yeah, th that's right. I mean, David, uh, Clive signed David Ackles to Columbia, and Clive was fired from Columbia when David was in the studio polishing up the final mixes of Five and Dime. And apparently he didn't know a soul at Columbia. And so that made it very difficult. And at the same time, he lost his manager. His manager just upped and left. And so he was left without a manager on a label where he knew nobody and the label probably didn't understand him. And that last album got a very it's almost you get the sense it was a contractual obligation release, really. Columbia put it out because they had to, but there wasn't a big promotion for it, and it wasn't released in the UK, where he had a pretty probably a bigger audience than he did in America. So that was the end. But it could have been different if Clive Davis had stayed.
What was the impetus to writing about Lowell George?
It was suggested to me that was a long time ago. I did that book. It was a slightly interesting scenario because Little Feat didn't want a book about them, so it was just a book about Lowell George. It wasn't, and clearly he is mainly known for leading Little Feat for until he died. But of course, he made a great solo album. But he was an interesting guy because I was particularly interested in all the sessions he did because when Little Feat were quite a big band, he was playing sessions with everybody. Loads and loads of records where he'd turn up into a 3 hour session and play guitar on this or that. So he was a very versatile and flexible musician. Funnily enough, I heard from his family just recently, a few months ago, regarding a tribute album that's just come out, which I haven't heard yet, but they got back in touch again.
There's sometimes a connection sometimes between that brilliant mind, that overly creative mind, and having sometimes taking the wrong road. Do you think that, or is that just what happenstance?
I don't know. I in some sense, it can sometimes seem like that, but I do worry that can somehow create a kind of dynamic where it you have to become a destructive personality to be creative, and
Like self-fulfilling prophecy of that, yeah.
yeah, I'm not sure about that. I think there's a lot of probably a lot of pressure in the music business at the time, and people were very often working extremely hard in a way that I think musicians like in the 60s and 70s, where you had a very high proportion of rock casualties, the work rate was phenomenal. Several albums a year, touring all the time. I think very often those people were really squeezed. The business was trying to get everything out of them, and perhaps that strain really worked against some people.
I'm looking here, American Troubadours, groundbreaking singer-songwriters of the 60s. You're going into such a rich, powerful time of musicians who basically changed the landscape for future. And you mentioned David Ackles in there, right?
Yeah, there's a chapter on David Ackles in that book. That's not nine mini profiles of singer-songwriters. So Tom Rush is in there, Tim Buckley, David Blue, and David Ackles is one of them. But I think in that book, I think I say that David Ackles is an outlier. It really although he's often grouped with all of those people, there is something different about him.
Yeah.
He- and that book's 25 years old now, but I still think that he's in his own niche, really.
What's your sense of purpose? Do you have a lot more books in you? You don't sound like a guy that's going to quit anytime soon.
Well, I hope so. I mean, it's funny you should say that because I'm at the age as you are when a lot of my contemporaries are retiring, and I don't see any need to. The people I admire, who I know who are older than me, are people who keep engaged with things. And I, I, I had the privilege of working a little bit with Jack Holtzman, who started Elektra Records. I worked with him about 15 years ago on a book. I wasn't working for the publisher who published the book, and Jack at the time was 80, and he was still working full time, and he wasn't pretending to be a young guy, had a hearing aid in, white hair and everything like that, but very engaged, uh, really interested in everyone, and really full of excitement still about what he was doing. And I thought that seems to me so much better than sitting in a chair and watching TV all day.
Well, Jack Holtzman's an interesting character. It's so cool that you had a chance to work with him.
Mm. Yeah, he was a great guy. Yeah, we spoke about David Ackles a bit actually because he was David. He said that David Ackles was one of the people. There was a sort of disappointment that he couldn't make it work commercially for David Ackles. I think there was a lot of respect between Jack and David. David Ackles always spoke very highly of Jack. I think he was fortunate to be on Elektra because they kept him for 3 albums, even though he wasn't selling. So he was able to develop.
Yeah.
That probably wouldn't happen now these days. There isn't an automatic correlation between talent and earning lots of money in music. There are many people who are really good and they just didn't get there commercially.
Is there a next book?
Well, I hope so, but I haven't made any decisions yet.
Again, I looked you up and I said The Sound of Tomorrow: How Electronic Music Was Smuggled into the Mainstream. Can you tell me just a little about that book?
Well, I'm really interested in very early electronic music, and by that I mean before synthesizers. So when people made electronic music with tape and oscillators and what have you, and that sort of electronic music is often the story of it is often told as like very highbrow art music but it actually, that sort of music was used in television and radio drama and film really early on. So you've got Hollywood films from the 40s and TV shows in the 50s using electronic music way before rock music ever got anywhere near it. And so it's about very early popular uses of electronic music.
Is that more used in the mystery side of it, or was it used in any kind of mood?
It it was for a long time. It was very strongly associated with science fiction, and but not exclusively. So a very famous example is the Forbidden Planet, the 1950s film. The music is entirely electronic tones, and by Louis and Bibi Baron, who were a married couple at the time, and that sort of association of electronic music and science fiction is quite strong, but it's also there's a very famous film, Spellbound, in 1945, where the use of electronic music is kind of associated with the main character's mental illness. And so, and there's another film where electronic music is used to signify that the main characters struggle with alcohol, for example. So it's not exclusively mystery or science fiction, but certainly for quite a long time, I would say for most of the 40s and 50s, that was the main association.
Did you ever get into prog or anything? Were you ever into that?
No, I wasn't. See, I first got into music with punk, really, and so when I was younger, I looked back on prog with a sort of an element of disdain, which is probably completely unreasonable. But so no, I missed out on prog entirely.
Well, that's why when, they talk about Yes and Genesis and they talk about them still selling, there were some of the few, but there was that punk thing,
Mm.
pre-post punk, that it was a difficult you did exactly what I think a lot of people were doing, going, well, no, we've had enough of this. Thank you very much. It's time to rebel.
Yeah, well, that's right, and I think I think there was something good in that because that, but I also think it was a bit too um, legalistic, if you like, to sort of draw such a line. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because most of those bands who were dismissed by punk actually just kept quiet for a year or two and then came back and was big as ever. So
Have you ever written about punk? Have you ever,
not in book form. No, I've written a few articles. I'm a big fan of the Saints, the Australian band, and I've just written a piece about them actually. That they were sort of punk era band, but that they grew their own sound, which was sounds exactly what most people would think is punk, but almost like entirely in isolation, without reference, without really knowing what else was happening around the world. But they're a band I love.
how would you describe David Ackles to a newbie?
How would I describe him? He's a theatrical piano playing singer songwriter who writes character driven songs.
Mark, I really appreciated it and I enjoyed this. This has been fun.
Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, I enjoyed it as well. Thank you very much.
Take good care of yourself.
And you. See you soon. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Remember, if you want to support the channel, there's a PayPal link right at the top of the description. Make sure you like our videos, comment on them, and share them on social media. I'm John Bowden. This is Rock History Music.